Good morning, colleagues. Thank you so much for joining us this morning for this virtual consultation forum, where we hope to share with us some of the progress that we've made to date on the POPIA Code of Conduct for Research. This is a code of conduct which is being developed under the auspices of the Academy of Science of South Africa. We realize that we have over 1,000 people registered for this webinar, but we hope that you will post your questions and that we'll be able to answer them. So my name is Michelle Ramsey. I'm a geneticist and a researcher, and that is why this code of conduct is important to me, because our group generates an enormous amount of data that we need to share responsibly, both within South Africa and beyond. So as you are all aware, the Protection for Personal Information Act of 2013 came into effect in July 2020 with a grace period of 1 year to comply. So by the 1st of July 2021, we will all need to comply with the POPIA. So Chapter 7 makes provision for the development of codes of conduct, and that is really to help us interpret POPIA, because POPIA is principle-based, and we need more information in terms of how to apply it in relationship to research. So once the Code of Conduct has been approved by the information regulator, it will come into force and will be legally binding on our group. So why do we need a code of conduct for research? So one of the reasons is that it is not clear how to interpret some of the principles that are in the Act at the moment and how they will apply in practice to research. Secondly, POPIA makes provision for certain exceptions, and we need to understand how and where these apply to research. But perhaps most importantly, we need a uniform approach in South Africa in terms of how we regulate personal information generated during the process of research across all the different sectors that do research in South Africa. The information regulator has made it very clear that whoever puts forward a code of conduct needs to be sufficiently representative of the sector it is representing, and that is why the Academy of Science of South Africa is appropriate for representing research and researchers in South Africa. So many of you are from the academic sector, and you are aware that the University South Africa, the USAF, has developed a code of conduct that many of the universities are currently working with and complying with. And the code of conduct that we are developing for research will be complementary to the USAF code of conduct, which doesn't have great detail on research. So just to give you a bird's eye view on the process of developing this code of conduct. So the Academy of Science of South Africa has convened two committees, a steering committee and a drafting committee, with representation across different disciplines, including law, ethics, research, and so forth, but also having representation from some of the main stakeholders in research in South Africa, including USAF, the South African Medical Research Council, the CSIR, the Department of Health, etc. So we also have been consulting with external experts, and this has been incredibly valuable as we've developed our thoughts around the code of conduct, and we will continue to consult with many different people. So there have been several opportunities already for public input, and as many of you will know, there were two events held late last year, where we had many participants and many questions raised that have helped us through the process of developing the code. Today we have our public webinar, and we will request written input from you within about 2 weeks. And once we have submitted the code of conduct to the information regulator, which we intend to do by the end of May, that will also be available for public response and written inputs. So you can see that we are more or less on track. I know that for many of you, you feel that time is going by very quickly, and I think 2 months to have this in place is a huge challenge, but I think we're meeting our deadlines and we should be able to do this. And we're hoping to get your inputs as we are in this final stretch of developing the code. So very importantly, this morning, on the South African Journal of Science website, we've put up a commentary and a discussion document related to this code of conduct for research. And I'm sure many of you will do a quick screen grab so that you can actually go in and look at these two documents. So the commentary, first of all, frames this code of conduct, why it came about, and why the Academy of Science of South Africa is the custodian of this code of conduct. But importantly is the second document, which is a longer document, which is actually discussing some of the issues that we think are pertinent to the developing of the code and issues into which we would really like your inputs. And we therefore have put a sort of deadline for Friday, the 14th of May, to get your written inputs so that we can collate them and address them. So we have a full program today, and I will introduce each of the speakers just before they speak. These are all members of our two committees, and they have been involved and have come up with some consensus ideas that we have, but we really do want your inputs. So please start posting information and questions on the Q&A. We would prefer you not to use the chat because it is easier to manage the questions on the Q&A box. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Rachel Addendums to talk to us about the progress that we've made to date on the Code of Conduct. Thank you. Over to you, Rachel.
Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many people online. This is such an important initiative that we've been a part of, and it's really wonderful and important to be involving all of you in this. So thank you, Michelle. I'm going to speak to 4 things today, and then some of my other colleagues are going to go into more detail about some of the items I'm flagging now. So I'm going to talk about the scope of the code, who does the code apply to, and what kinds of research does it apply to, how Papia will function in relation to other existing regulatory frameworks that currently govern research in South Africa, what the code of conduct will address, and then how the code of conduct will be governed. And I hope I can do this relatively quickly so we have lots of time for questions. So the code will apply to all institutions in South Africa that conduct academic, scholarly, scientific research. It will apply to both industry and academia alike, but it will be focused on research that is intended for publication, that's intended for public dissemination, that follows a recognized scientific methodology or system of analysis. It applies to all disciplines of research, from law and theology to social science and health and education. And it applies to research activities that involve the processing of personal information, that collects, processes, or stores personal information as part of their research activities. So this code does not apply if you are to the administrative processes that are associated with an institution that conducts research. We're looking specifically at the functions and the process of conducting research itself. Now, typically, such research projects would already undergo prior independence ethics review. Ethics review, as I'll speak about in this slide, ethics review is required under the National Health Act and under the Bill of Rights in terms of consent. Ethics review is required when you are doing a research project that involves human participants. And if you are using personal information as defined under Papia in terms of a living human, you are in some way therefore involving human participants. So we have already the National Health Act, and with it the Department of
Rachel, your sound is a problem.
It seems that Rachel has lost contact with us because I can see both her screen is frozen and her slide is still up. So we'll just give it a minute and hope that she can link back in again. So I think she's just logged off. So hopefully she'll come back in a minute. I can see that we already have over 600 participants on this webinar, which is really exceptional. And just again, for me to thank everybody for joining us. Clearly, this is very important for researchers across South Africa, and we all want to understand how we're going to be managing under POPIA responsible use of personal information gathered through research. I can see Rachel is back. Welcome back, Rachel. And please continue. Thank you.
Hi, I'm so sorry. What a terrible time to be losing internet connection. So I'm going to just quickly move on. Thank you, Michelle. I'm going to quickly move on to the kind of meaty stuff that we're all interested to know about. What will the Code of Conduct cover? So the information regulator has provided certain guidance on certain things that any Code of Conduct needs to cover. This includes how the provisions, the 8 conditions for processing personal information apply in relation to the particular class or information or sector that the Code of Conduct speaks to. So we'll be looking at that, how the 8 conditions in relation to how the 8 conditions of POPIA in relation to research function, how the exemptions, so when a provision doesn't apply to a particular class of information or a particular individual or institutional body at a particular point, the exceptions when a provision is in place except for when, and some of those things include you are using the information for research purposes, and exclusions when the Act simply does not apply, when POPIA simply doesn't apply, for example, to information that's de-identified. So the Code of Conduct will be looking at how exemptions, exceptions, and exclusions under POPIA relate in relation to research. Then we will be looking at a couple of other things that my colleagues will speak about in more detail as follows. So social media data and how this can be used in a way that's compliant with POPIA for research, information matching programs, processing genetic information and for genomics research, cross-border data transfers, how we can legally share information with other countries. And this becomes particularly important because the POPIA provides certain provisions for when you want to share information outside of South Africa. And this relates to some of the other data protection laws in the world, one of which is the General Data Protection Regulation under the European Union. So you cannot be sharing data outside of South Africa unless you are sharing it with a country that has an adequate level of data protection regulation, or there is an agreement in place that provides that level of protection. So in terms of South Africa's kind of compatibility within the research market, within the international research market, it's really important that we put in place provisions that ensure that our data protection regulatory system within South Africa is adequate to continue sharing data and continue working with countries in Europe and in other parts of the world. It will also address security safeguards and prior authorizations, which I'll speak to in more detail now. So one of the main things that POPIA is going to change within the research environment when we're conducting research is it's going to, unfortunately, create more paperwork. It's going to create more documentation, which falls under the condition of processing under POPIA of openness and transparency, which includes record keeping. So we are suggesting that this record keeping in relation to research projects takes place within the data management plans, and it will need to include certain things. And we haven't come to an exhaustive list yet of what this will include, but it certainly will include what is the lawful basis you are relying on in order to do your processing of personal information lawfully. Who is the responsible party? Are you so big a research project involving different institutions in South Africa or internationally that you require information officers and responsible parties to be the PIs? Or will the responsible party just be the information officer and the institution you are a part of? It will also include a risk assessment, which I'll speak about in a minute. This will be a kind of prior risk assessment you'll need to take and undergo at the same time you do your ethics review to determine whether your research project is a kind of high-risk research project in terms of POPIA. And if it is high risk, you will need to conduct a full privacy impact assessment that then becomes reviewed by the information officer of the institution. And then your record and process of consent will also need to be included in the data management plan. So in terms of the risk assessments, some of the things that will need to be included as part of the kind of indicators within that, as part of the guidance for what constitutes something of higher risk, a study of higher risk, it will be kinds of things like what type of personal information are you processing? And it will be higher risk if you're processing special personal information as defined under POPIA, like health information, biometrics, race, whether you're processing personal information of children that also have a higher level of safeguards, if you're transferring information outside of South Africa, and whether you're transferring information to a country with a very strong data protection regulatory system or with no regulatory system, whether you're using information matching programs as part of your research study, what level of consent you are using and what safeguards you have in place. And then the last thing that I've got here that the Code of Conduct will address is prior authorizations. So under section, I think that should say 57 of POPIA, it provides that the information regulator must provide prior authorizations if you are using unique identifiers, so a telephone number or an ID number, as part of your processing, and you link that within a kind of information matching system. So if you're linking that with another database, whether manually or automatically, and then you also require prior authorization if you're transferring special personal information or the information of a child to a country outside of South Africa that does not have an adequate data protection regulatory system in place. So in terms of POPIA, when there is a code of conduct in place, bodies do not have to go to the information regulator to apply for a prior authorization. Prior authorizations can be provided on a kind of blanket basis for that sector within the code of conduct. So this is a really, really important thing that our code of conduct will need to set out for the research sector. So lastly, the Code of Conduct needs to provide for how it will be governed. This is part of the requirements that the information regulator has set out for codes of conduct. So research institutions that are bound by the code will need to report annually to ASAF on the number of complaints they've received in relation to the code and how they were resolved. ASAF will also need to handle complaints in relation to the code, and the IR has provided guidance on how the complaints handling procedure must function. So in most instances, ASAF will not be the first port of call if a data subject, a research participant, in our case, has a complaint. That research participant would first go to the ethics committee that approved the study, as they normally would. If it is a health research ethics committee that's registered with the NHREC or another ethics committee that's registered with the NHREC, then the NHREC will be the second port of call for the research participant or data subject if they're aggrieved by the outcome at the REC level. If they are still aggrieved following the NHREC process, or if it's an ethics committee that's not registered with the NHREC, then the complaint can be brought to ASAF before the last point of call to the information regulator. And ASAF will need to appoint an independent adjudicator who will then assess the merits of the case against the Code of Conduct. So that's it from me. Thank you very much, Michelle, and we look forward to all your questions.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I'm hoping you've already answered some of the questions that people have through your summary. Thank you very much. So I'd now like to invite Jerome Singh to give a few reflections. He's also part of the steering committee and has given a lot of inputs. Jerome, are you ready? Please put on your video and over to you.
I'm just trying to get my share screen. Give me a few seconds. I think probably in the absence of me trying to, of course, have it to get the share screen, I may have to end up just talking you through what I have on my screen, unless somebody can give me a quick idea.
Jerome, could you put on your video, please, so that people can see?
I see the share screen now. Thank you.
Okay,
just give me
excellent.
a second.
And your video as well, please.
Yes, I'll do that. Give me one second. Okay, so now I'm hoping everything is on the screen.
We can see your slides. I don't know if you want to make it full screen. Otherwise, we can just proceed as is.
Yes, okay, so I'll try to do the full screen.
Perfect.
Okay, so I'm hoping that's it now. So thanks again for inviting me to give a brief overview. And my topic is probably not going to be exactly what I'm going to be focusing on. I'll try to cover a little bit more in terms of the code. And, you know, we've had many debates and discussions as to who should be covered and who is excluded, and basically looking at the different sectors. So I thought what will be helpful is to just have a quick overview on exactly what the code is going to be covering and the complexities that we are dealing with. So in terms of the natural science and engineering sector, I thought I'll just put a brief overview here of how big the field actually is. You know, you have a range of different fields here. And I think, you know, when we look at these fields, we have an assumption, or usually an assumption, that many of these disciplines don't directly involve human participants. But of course, I think we need to also remember that some of these fields indirectly and are increasingly beginning to directly involve human participants. So we're looking at information technology and computer technology fields. This is going to be something that, of course, is going to be looking at human participants or human data a lot more when we're looking at artificial intelligence. So I think, you know, some of these fields have traditionally not involved human participants, but I think this is an idea that, or it's just introducing the concept here, this is something that could become much more important in the years ahead. So when we're looking at the code, these are the types of fields that we have in terms of our research and developmental overview in South Africa. This is what our National Science Survey takes into account, but all these different fields, in a sense, will, if they're involving human participants, theoretically should be, in fact, looking at this code of conduct. Of course, we've got the social science and humanities field, we've got social sciences, behavioral sciences and humanities. All of these fields involve human participants to some degree or the other, directly or sometimes indirectly, if you're looking at data and you're not necessarily directly involving human participants. But I think also what I thought I would do here is to look at, and to be, for all of us to be mindful of the complexity of the scope and the overlap between the public and the private sector. So I just thought I'd quickly highlight here how complex this is to take into account and to decide on who we're going to cover and who we're not going to cover. In the 2018 and 2019 National Research and Development Survey that South Africa does annually, we had approximately 85,000 personnel involved in research and development in the country. This is a very rough overview here, and these figures were slightly updated for the 2020-2021 year, but I thought I'll just give you a quick overview here. But essentially, these 85,000 people are made up of these following sectors, and I think there's probably a few gaps as well. And I thought I would just explain to you why we don't necessarily cover certain fields in particular, but you can see from just this overview here, there's quite a huge number of researchers that are involved in research and development. Not necessarily all are involved in human research, but it does give you an idea of how big the potential field is in terms of potential users of a code. In terms of also the mindful of the complexity, I think it's also important to realize as well that when we're looking at the public and private sectors, the private sector itself is not one bland monologue of actors. There's quite a few different actors here, and they involve multiple modalities. So I thought I'll just give you a quick overview here. But when we're looking at the corporate sector, we have to be mindful that the corporate sector is quite big. It's not one particular company involved. You'll find that there are several sectors and several fields, and some of them are more involved in human research than others. So, for example, you find mining companies very often do research in human subjects or human participants when they're looking at, for example, TB in the mines or occupational health and safety issues. So that's just one example here. But there's the corporate sector. We've got contract research organizations, and those would be research organizations that are not part of any academic sector or science council, but they very often get outsourced to do some of the research. They are private sector. We've got political and opinion survey polling, for example, Ipsos. That's a whole big sector by itself. You've got market sector or market research sector actors. And of course, you've got a range of different actors that are public-private partnership. And you'll find that this may be, for example, service providers who get funding from foreign sources of funding or even domestic. They may be doing service provision on behalf of, for example, USAID. They'll be funded by them, but they're involved in partnering with government to provide services for medical male circumcision, but they'll have a research component. So you'll find that you get that mix. And then, of course, you've also got the NGO sector. So a big NGO sector in the context of South Africa may be, for example, MSF, where they're doing service provision, but they're also doing humanitarian outreach, but they're doing a research component as well. So this is the example I thought we'll just quickly give you an overview here of how complex it is to try to provide a code of conduct for all these different players, and which is why we've decided that certain of these sectors, in fact, are governed by their own governance structures. And it may be more appropriate for some of these sectors, for example, the private sector, to in fact maybe have their own players involved in writing to the information regulator for their own bespoke codes of conduct. And so I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to maybe take questions a bit later. But I thought that between Rachel, Michelle, and myself, we'll just give you a quick overview of how complex the field is and how onerous the task is to try to purport to speak on behalf of everyone. It may not necessarily be possible to do that. And there may be more appropriate actors in the field to speak on behalf of certain sectors, which is why the scope is not intended to cover everyone. And I'll stop there, and I'm not sure if Michelle or Rachel, who are the two main people driving this process, have anything to add with this here or on this issue, but I'll be happy to take questions a bit later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerome. That was a very useful oversight in terms of, how we have grappled with this whole issue of to whom the code of conduct will apply. So the scope has really been one of the things that has been most challenging to us as a set of committees, and we look forward to further inputs. Thank you very much, Jerome. So without further ado, I'll go on to the next section of the program now. So we're going to have 4 short presentations that will follow one on the next, and I'll introduce each speaker just before they speak. But the idea is that, these are 4 areas that we think have been most difficult to think about how we will comply in terms of POPIA. And that is why we've highlighted them. But of course, there are many other issues that are also on the radar and will be included in the Code of Conduct. So I'd like to introduce Professor Jantine de Vries, who's going to talk to us about consent and how we think about consent in the context of research. Jantine, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Michelle. I'm just sharing my slides. Good morning, everyone. Lots of questions in the chat, with lots of concern about some of the things that we're hoping to propose, and so I fully recognize that. And I think Jerome's kind of reminder just now was very helpful in terms of situating the complexity of what we're trying to do here. Cool. So many of you know, or hopefully know, that under Papia defines consent as a voluntary, specific, and informed expression of will in terms of which permission is given for the processing of personal information. Papia also mentions specific types of information that need to be shared with the persons who information belongs to, including what information is being collected and for what reason, whether it will be shared and with whom, details of who is responsible, how you can object and where you need to direct complaints. That's kind of mandatory information about the personal information that is being collected in the conduct, in our case, in the research process. Now, it's really important for our purposes to recognize that when Papia speaks about consent, that consent is the consent that is required to legally conform to Papia. It is not the same as the ethical requirements for consent. So consent, as we think about it in the research process, or have traditionally thought about it in the research process, is not necessarily the same as consent for Papia, which is much more narrowly focused on information about data. Papia, as you have heard already, includes a specific prohibition on the processing of special personal information. And for research, what is important is that special personal information includes information about health, race and ethnicity, as well as the general category of biometric data, which includes genetic data. So Papia has a general prohibition on the processing of that kind of information. But there are a number of important exemptions, and there are specific research exemptions that are important for us. So the general prohibition on processing special information does not apply if consent is provided, and then particularly the kind of information that I spoke about in the previous slide is provided. If the processing is for historical, statistical, or research purposes that are specifically in the public interest, so if there is an argument that the processing is in the public interest and that it is for historical, statistical, or research purposes, then there is an exemption on the prohibition of processing that special information. Similarly, if it's impossible or very difficult to seek consent, and the processing is for research purposes, but note that research doesn't necessarily have to be in the public interest, then the general prohibition, the exemption would also apply. Or if you, my apologies, some noise at the background, or if the information regulator has authorized the process through a special exemption that you need to seek. Now, in terms of further processing, so this is anybody who is involved with data sharing of any sort, either receiving data or sharing the data that you have collected. Papia speaks about that in using the term further processing. And further processing under Papia will be permissible for research purposes if the information will not be published in an identifiable manner. So if the further processing involves data that is not identifiable, that cannot reasonably lead to the identification of a person, then that further processing is permissible. But beyond that, it is also permitted for research purposes where the processing is necessary to prevent or mitigate a serious or imminent threat to public health or to the life or health of the data subject. So there are exemptions, or there are conditions under which further processing are permissible, but obviously there are some questions about what it means for data not to be identifiable when you deal with certain kinds of biometric information, or I read in the Q&A section a question about GPS data, for instance, where that could potentially lead to the identification of a person. And this is part of what the code will need to speak to. In summary, kind of our assessment of what that means is the following. One, that research studies really must include as much information as possible at the time of data collection about how the personal information will be used in future, if at all. So to the extent that you know what you intend to do at the time of data collection, you need to be specific to participants in what you're proposing to do. We also have come to the conclusion that further processing is allowed for research purposes if the information is not published in an identifiable form, if consent has been obtained, or if information is already in the public domain. So those of you, for instance, using genomic data that is already in the public domain, that seems to suggest that that would be exempted from, or POPIA would not apply. We also have come to the conclusion that the various consent forms that are currently described in the DOH guidelines seem compatible with POPIA, particularly considering the research exemptions and the specific provisions that it makes for further processing of data. We have at the moment, and you can read some of this in the discussion document and the link that Michelle shared earlier, several tentative proposals. One is the mandatory self-assessment that Rachel spoke about. So all research that involves the collection or processing of personal information going forward should be subjected to a self-assessment, private risk self-assessment to determine the risk of harm, and that needs to be recorded. The outcome of that self-assessment will need to be recorded in the data management plan. So researchers going forward will need to develop data management plans where they specifically speak to the kinds of personal information that are being collected, as well as the risk of a privacy breach relating to that risk of harm. If the risk is low, then existing safeguards within the research infrastructure or ecosystem may be sufficient. But if the risk is high, then a full privacy risk assessment will need to be done, and additional safeguards might be required. And I think in the discussion document, we start speaking about what some of those might be. They could, for instance, include additional data use oversight through, for instance, data access committees, strong community engagement practices, including ongoing community engagement practices beyond the initial data collection, the potential introduction of a comprehension of informed consent test, and data protection mechanisms in place to prevent unauthorized use of data. The second proposal is that, as you remember from the first slide, there is particular kinds of information that are required when you speak about consent under POPIA. And we've tossed between thinking about whether that should be mandatory information that ought to be added to consent forms, or whether for ease of use, it might be easier to just put that into a separate data privacy notice, particularly if we have available templates that for easy use. And kind of wherever that decision falls, the importance of ensuring that there is that some of that information is provided during the consent process is going to be important going forward. It seems unquestionable that it is really important that templates of those data privacy notices will need to be developed. And I know I've seen in the quick Q&As several responses saying, well, it's not fair to upload this on HREX. And on the one hand, I agree. On the other, we're in a bit of a predicament. But it seems that HREX would be the natural kind of entity within the current existing research ethics oversight system to ensure that researchers have both completed a data privacy risk assessment and that the information either in the consent form or in the separate data privacy notice is sufficient to comply with the processing of information on the basis of consent. Now, this is the bit that some of you really won't like, which is that we are currently thinking about engaging with RECs to ensure that they are the first port of call for oversight of POPIA compliance. Now, I understand that on the one hand, that is not their natural role. On the other, they have already taken some of those tasks on board, for instance, in relation to ensuring the ethical standards of research with children as defined under the National Health Act, for instance. But also they are currently in many institutions the signatory party on the MTA that the Department of Health has introduced a while back. So they've already taken some of these kind of legal compliance tasks, and And in addition, in my institution, for instance, the researchers' compliance with the data management policy of the University of Cape Town, or the data sharing policy, has also fallen with HREC. So it's not an entirely alien task to ethics committees, although it is not necessarily a task that would naturally accrue to them. And we can speak about whether there could be other entities within institutions that should be mandated with ensuring POPIA compliance of individual research projects. Now, there's 3 specific tasks that we've identified that HRECs would need to monitor, and they include that a data privacy notice is submitted, that a data management plan is in place, and that the data privacy risk assessment is executed and appropriate where it is deemed that a high-risk study is involved. Obviously, this cannot be an unfunded mandate and would require dedicated resources, particularly personnel. It requires a bunch of SOPs and templates as well. So SOPs, so that HRECs are absolutely clear about what their compliance would involve, or their monitoring of compliance would involve, as well as a guidance on what would be considered a sufficient explanation to justify that obtaining consent is not reasonably practicable, as you understand, something I mentioned in my earlier slides. So Michelle, that was all that I said. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions in the chat about this, but it's just a high-level overview of some of our thinking to date.
Thank you very much, Jantina. And I think, as you've gone along, you have answered some of the questions that have been coming up, because I see that there are a lot that are related to informed consent, and particularly to the role of ethics committees. And we realize that this will involve more work, but as part of the code of conduct, we're hoping to develop templates that will be useful to recs as they go ahead with their work. So I'd now like to invite Professor Alan Christoffels to actually talk to us about information matching programs. Thank you. Over to you, Alan.
Thank you, Michelle. And I just wondered, there were 2 hands raised. Are we going to take that at the end? Maybe we could just inform the participants. I see those 2 hands have been raised for a while.
Thank you. So, Alan, we have over 650 participants, so we're not going to give the floor to any of the participants. So it's only the panelists who will be able to respond. So if I could just ask all the participants, please, to put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll try and get to them. But just for everybody, we won't forget them. We're keeping a record of them, and they will be addressed in aggregate form after this forum. Thank you. Please go ahead, Alan.
All right. Thanks very much. And so we have been a team that have been thinking about information matching programs and how this will be impacted by POPIA. And a question raised by Quibus on the Q&A was really around what does information matching program means? And if I've just lifted this directly from the Act, and it's really referring to comparison, whether it be manually or via some device, when you're comparing information contained in one document with another. And that is for the purpose of producing and verifying information that can be used for the purpose of taking action. And you can do this by either using some non-algorithmic means. You're basically comparing data across data sources. You could even be using different algorithms, and we think particularly of a lot of artificial intelligence methods that are starting to gain traction, and thinking through what does that mean in terms of our research when we are trying to utilize these strategies. And so if you look at the data sources, and we've covered this in a bit more detail in the discussion document, but just to alert you to the fact that I'm sure that you are aware that you could be thinking of data sources as ID numbers, phone numbers, geographical identifiers, and that too was a question that was raised in the chat. And I think from a research perspective, you probably agree with me that matching data that is in the public domain is probably very useful when we are when we consider some of the cost reduction, particularly as it pertains to collecting information. I think that the caution here really lies in the fact that through triangulating across these data sources, there might be a possibility of identifying your data subject. And so while there's certainly value add in terms of thinking through data minimization, especially when you don't wanting to look at communities that seems to be over-researched, I think we have to recognize the possibility that as researchers, the burden of proof is on us to ensure that we are being cognizant of any possibility of trying to identify a particular. Once you have our slides, it's just to keep a note that what you're seeing throughout the presentations are really concepts around what are the principles that govern data protection. But as a group, what we were really thinking around is what would be the overarching principles that would essentially guide us as researchers when one is considering information matching programs. And so certainly we have to be thinking through, what about confidentiality? Are we using de-identified data upfront? Is there a possibility of re-identification? And some of the processes by which we can ensure the confidentiality would speak to a provision within the Act which speaks around data security. And I want to just alert you to the fact that there are certain technical and also organizational measures that should be put in place. And I think as researchers, we shouldn't think that this is another layer of burdensome work that we're going to have to carry out just in order to initiate our research projects. But I think this becomes an opportunity to engage our institutions, our universities, where universities are also reaching a point where they are really having to make provision for certain policies in order to demonstrate how sensitive information within the university space is protected. And so technical measures such as encryption, who has access to certain data, who does not. I think those are the kind of discussions that we as researchers will have to have with our respective ICT departments, especially when one approaches drawing up a data management plan. And I think historically that has not been a requirement, and yet international funders are starting to make that a requirement. And so I certainly encourage researchers to apply your mind to this data management plan, because it has implications for even how we need to provision finances. What does it take in order to ensure that the data that we are utilizing will be protected if that is applied to our specific example? And so thinking through information management plan, another principle that certainly is at play is for us to think through whether the software that we are developing, are we considering stuff like privacy by design? How are we thinking through the development of our information matching programs such that we are ensuring the protection of information right from the start? And this is certainly something that is becoming a guiding principle in a number of countries. And so as we think through the use of information matching programs, whether those have been developed already or whether we are developing them from scratch, we have to give thought to what are the privacy principles that have been incorporated within the protocol. And these have to be described within our data management plans. Another consideration when one is looking at information matching programs is that of consent. And I think what you will find through a number of presentations today, as well as in the discussion document, is the idea that consent models need to be transparent. And so we have to provide the data subject or the research participant with clarity as to what information matching program is being used in this specific example, how it will be used, and if we intend to, in fact, utilize data sets that is potentially outside of the realm of the study. And so in terms of consent, in giving thought to the risks associated with using certain information matching program, and also the onus that now rests on the researcher to certainly describe the level of protection or the level of risk to the data subject, it's important for us to revisit our consent tools as a way to ensure that we have provided sufficient records of what it is that we are doing, and that information is then shared appropriately with your data subject. And so this really brings me to the risk assessment, and you've heard the previous speaker also speak about the risk assessment. And certainly from our side, in thinking through these information matching programs, we actually need to give thought to a risk assessment, but also a risk management process, which we are saying needs to really be part and parcel of the request to obtain approval for certain research projects. And this risks that are associated with your method or your algorithm, considering the level of risk that it will have to the data subject and how that will impact the individual. And I think this needs to be carefully articulated, and we are proposing that this needs to be done in the consent process. And I'm sure there will be those of you that are saying, so exactly what consent template are you going to be providing me with? I would like to think that as we garner comment on this discussion document, that you would give thought to how would the research environment that you find yourself in, and if you are using certain information matching programs, how are you currently informing and contributing to your consent documents? And I think we need to really assess whether those are truly in keeping with the current provisions that we have within the Protection of Personal Information Act. And so we are hoping that there'll be some collective input as we try and shape a code of conduct that will guide the researchers. And I think that you probably, just like me, feel somewhat daunted by the fact that we have to do this load of work, and what are we going to miss when trying to start up our research projects. And we are certainly hoping that through a code that could be certainly provided as a guide to researchers, we'll be able to think through what are the processes that we have to follow in order to ensure that sensitive information, and certainly the personal information of your data subject, is certainly protected. I think just to make a comment about the risk assessment, there are a number of researchers that is working in the artificial intelligence space. And so thinking through what is the likelihood of identifying a data subject, and one has to really think of practical ways, what are the objective factors that one will look at when one is trying to develop this risk assessment. And one could think of what would be the skill that will be required by somebody to re-identify. We know that the technology space moves very fast. And so given the available technology at the time, how likely is it that we would place a data subject at risk? And I think in my last slide, just to remind you again, when we spoke about what are the reasonable measures to ensure data security, to prevent data breaches, I think this is where, I think as you engage your ICT departments, I think it's important to have this conversation with them to understand, are there things within this table which we have included? What type of data protection do our respective institutions provide? as a way for us to rationalize and understand the level of security and protection that we would be offering the research participants. I think with that, I'm going to stop and happy to take questions at the end or via the Q&A. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you very much, Alan, for that very thoughtful presentation. And I think it will be obvious to all the participants here that each of the subcommittees have really been grappling with the issues at hand. And this is going to be something which is going to be challenging, I think, for everybody in terms of compliance with the code. So, Alan, I think already there are quite a few questions for you in the Q&A. So you can start thinking about those. And our next speaker is Dr. Dominique Anderson, and she's going to be talking to us about genomic research, this special type of information. Thank you, and over to you. Please, Dominique, if you could put on your video. Thank you.
Hi, Michelle. So I'm not going to be using my video today, but I just want to first talk about the fact that our committee, subcommittee works on the genomics and the Papaya Code of Conduct. Sorry, I'm just trying to. Okay, so genetic information is much like a personal fingerprint. Under Papaya, genetic characteristics are considered as special personal information, and genetic uniqueness of inherited characteristics can be considered biometric data. In the Act, genetic and biometric data are not separately defined, and as such, there is the need for a lawful basis for the processing of genomic data. However, under Section 32(5) of Papaya, processing of health information concerning inherited characteristics is permitted if a serious medical interest prevails, or if the processing is necessary for historical, statistical, or research activity. We all know that the technologies that generate genetic information are rapidly advancing, and the associated costs for generating such data are decreasing. This has allowed research which generates and processes genetic data to become both more accessible and more affordable. There is a substantial translational benefit to genomic approaches in research. In the health sphere, for example, new knowledge has contributed to greater understanding of disease epidemiology, and it has contributed to innovations in diagnostics and therapeutics. Going forward, however, it is essential to ensure that no one is left behind in the genomics revolution and that all can benefit from research which could lead to potential beneficial innovations. For this vision to be actualized, it is imperative that genomic data is made publicly available and is also representative of all people. This translates to a strong privacy requirement. And there are also externally driving factors which need to be considered. For example, funders require research data sets to be made available, and researchers do share their data in the spirit of open research and collaboration. The genetic code of an individual cannot be de-identified in the classical sense. The risks for data privacy related to personal information lies in the potential for re-identification and the potential for discrimination through the use of genetic information. It has been demonstrated that an individual or even a family member can indeed be re-identified from the DNA fingerprint. But this has been subject to cross-referencing secondary, direct, or indirect identifiers. Raw data of the genetic code from a sequencing run cannot by itself be used to identify a data subject. A string of nucleotides needs to first undergo bioinformatic processing, such as alignment to a reference and annotation. The resulting genome may still not be sufficient to identify a data subject. However, if combined with various other secondary identifiers, the probability of identification becomes more real. And the more linkages that can be formed results in a greater risk of not only identification of the data subject, but also a principle of singling out. So it is clear that if available secondary identifiers can be linked to the DNA fingerprint, this is an important concept to understand. Because genetic information about an individual can also reveal information about close and distant biological relatives, protecting genetic privacy is far more complex than the safeguarding of other types of personal data. It is difficult to determine the level and type of privacy controls needed in genomic research. However, the appropriate consent approaches with specific reference to potential local and international sharing, as well as detailed information about data access and use, must be in place. In this way, the responsible party will need to perform a risk assessment in order to ascertain the privacy controls needed, as well as the mechanisms required. It is also important to note that we also need to consider the fact that resource limitation should not be a factor in limiting an institution's ability to perform such important research. Research projects in genomics must be subject to rigid ethical review processes, which are also able to assess regulatory compliance. In terms of identification risk, responsible parties will need to conduct personal privacy assessments. This would evaluate if re-identification and subsequent harm to the data subject is reasonably practical, and the higher the risk, the greater the need for more stringent privacy measures. The ways in which genomic data can be safeguarded includes encryption and decryption techniques, standard IT hygiene, which Alan alluded to in his previous talk, access limitation, as well as the organizational policies and procedures. So there are some discussion points in the genomic section of the Papaya Code of Conduct. The first item is to consider that Papaya is applicable to living natural persons. So in the case of genomics research from non-living persons, there are implications for living relatives. Should there be an attempt to obtain consent from the living relatives, or will another lawful basis for processing this data become a better option? In the case where pathogen or microbiome sequencing occurs, the data subject is a human. This means that Papaya will apply despite the fact that the microbe is the primary target. So should assessments in this sector include detailed processes which show how contaminating human genomic material is removed from the process? What is the possible impact on forensic research, and should exemptions apply here? What are the implications and risks related to combinatorial approaches such as AI? If data is publicly available or accessed from one of many private service providers for research, will Papaya apply? And importantly, who becomes the responsible party? The responsible party is also a big question in terms of collaborations. We also need to consider the future use of the genetic data. Lastly, we focus on genomics in this particular section, but there are other omics techniques which can be considered to create a fingerprint profile of an individual. So what are the considerations when we look at multi-omics approaches? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dominique, for laying that out so clearly. I think hopefully that is also answering some of the questions that people have about this unique type of information that is uniquely identifying, but not necessarily identifiable in terms of a person unless, as you say, there are information that actually will link these two bits together. So our last presentation is going to be by Dr. Antoinelle Olkers, and she'll be talking to us about research using information from social media. Again, I can see that that is something which is of concern to many. Antoinelle, once you put on your video, please go ahead.
Thank you, Michelle. So this morning, I'm just reporting back on the work of the members of the social media subcommittee. And I have listed them here for your information. So in terms of social media, POPIA allows information in the public domain to be used and processed without consent. So although we have noted the ethical guidelines of the HPCSA in terms of social media, there is no other legislation that currently regulates social media in South Africa. So the lawful basis for processing information from social media platforms under POPIA is therefore not consent. Yes, and there's a few detailed exemptions. So we envisage 3 scenarios in terms of research purposes. 1, the information can be identified, so the data subject can no longer reasonably be re-identified. So de-identification has to happen to a level where the data subject can no longer reasonably be re-identified, and therefore it falls outside of the scope of POPIA. The second scenario is information is not de-identified, and I will talk about that. And then the information cannot be identified. There are other aspects to consider in terms of cases involving minors and other vulnerable groups. So the overarching principle in terms of privacy expectation is that the data subject's expectation of privacy is literally a function of the privacy settings that is activated and or then sometimes even associated with a platform. So data shared without activating these privacy settings, so if a data subject shares it without activating the privacy settings, so making their account private, then the data subject cannot have an expectation of privacy because the data subject themselves decided to place the information in the public domain. When we use the social media data in research, the overarching principles, the main 2 were collecting only the research relevant information. So we have to weigh whether the specific data that we want to collect should actually be collected or not. And then also de-identification as early as possible. So this includes what we described as a decoupling process, where we decouple the location data from other data, for instance, and also that data then be disconnected from the actual social media post prior to the processing for research. So what approvals will be needed? So the following applies to data that is not in the public domain. Jantina already alluded to the role of research ethics committees and how important that will be. And we would want for the recs then to note 1, how the data was obtained, and 2, the original intent of the data subject. And there is of course other relevant legislation that will also have to be adhered to. We wanted to point out that this includes data collection for use in the following ways: scraping and scrubbing. So scraping to collect data, and also the processing of data that was obtained via scraping. And then also data scrubbing, which is a form of cleaning your data or your data set, and therefore a form of data processing. So when we use the social media data in research, we would have to do the following to ensure that we refer to the correct post. And we discussed this, and it was not easy to decide what metrics or what characteristics then to be included. So what information? The data subject name or surname, the social media platform that is used, the social media handle under which this is posted, the date and the time, knowing that all of this information may then already be in the public domain. And also we thought to advise that a copy of the original post should be kept as approved, because as we know, these posts can be deleted and altered after the original post. It's also important to note that transnational jurisdictions are often involved. And aspects to note in this context is where the data originated, where it is posted, and where it will be processed. But we are cognizant of the fact that some of these above factors that we do think is important to take into consideration may in fact not be known to the researcher. So the intent of the data subject matters. The post can be, for instance, people post to elicit responses, so likes, retweets, etc. Therefore, technically asking to establish relationships. So posts have the potential to establish relationships. And if a data subject posts on a specific topic or for a specific purpose, and we as researchers then wishes to use that information for another purpose, consent will have to be obtained, unless, of course, if the post is in the public domain. So the intent of the data subject was also underscored by the statement of the information regulator in terms of WhatsApp, where in terms of section 57 of Papia, the IR stated that WhatsApp may not process any contact information of its users for a purpose other than the one for which the number was specifically intended at collection, with the aim of linking that information jointly with information processed by other companies within the within the WhatsApp circle, unless it obtains prior authorization from the IR. And I just want to point out here the underlines are my emphasis. So this statement by the IR reinforced the principle that the intent of the data subject matters. So in terms of determining whether a legitimate interest of the responsible party, what that is, the relationship between the responsible party and the data subject must be taken into account. However, it is not as simple as it seems, because these relationships may exist. There may be a direct relationship between the responsible party, if it is the PI of a project, and the data subject, but there may also not be such a direct relationship or any relationship at all. So the privacy settings of the data subject account. In a public account, of course, it's easier to deal with in terms of POPIA. The information is in the public domain and the consent to use data is then not required. However, when we look at private accounts, that information is not in the public domain and consent is required. So social media groups poses a particular challenge in this context. We do require consent from the data subject, but we also have to note that the consent may have already been provided by the data subject when they perhaps joined that group. Now we come to the terms and conditions of the specific group, or it may actually be already embedded in the terms and conditions of that specific platform. So if we cannot obtain consent from the specific data subject, alternatively, we have to contact the administrator of a group, who is then required to post an opt-out for this specific research project to the members of that social media group. Terms and conditions of platforms, they are problematic because they are often bundled. The data subject cannot select individual options, for instance, to use the platform but not have their data used for research or used by the platform for other purposes. After the GDPR came into effect, of course, many platforms did adjust their terms and conditions. However, often they still do not allow a specific option for their data to be used in research or not. Research, we advise, has to traverse this area carefully. And of course, we are hoping that we can clarify this aspect during public consultation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antoinelle, for just highlighting again the enormous complexity here and how to kind of grapple with different kinds of social media data. So thank you very much to the 4 presenters who have shared with us the information from their subcommittees. And this brings us now to the next part of the program, which is the really exciting part, which is grappling with your questions and trying to answer some of them. So if I could ask the panelists where they are comfortable to do so, please to switch on their videos, because then we can see you on our screens and it's sort of easier to interact. So that would be very useful. Thank you. I think the way that I will do this is to start off the questions, and then I will ask different people on the panel, please to raise their hands if they'd like to highlight some of the questions that have not been answered, and just to thank the panelists for the tremendous job of dealing with some of the questions. I can see that many of you have been really active in just responding, so I think that's incredibly useful. So maybe if I could start out, I see that there were some questions right at the beginning, Rachel, dealing with, you know, why are we giving this responsibility to the research ethics committees? And people also wanting to know what is the role of the National Health Research Council in this whole process. So if you could perhaps take us through that again, please, Rachel.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, ultimately, the information officer within a research performing institution, within an institution that does research as part of how we're setting out what research means here and is therefore governed by this code, the information officer is the party that would ultimately be legally responsible for ensuring compliance with this code of conduct. We have to look at what are the safeguards that can be put in place to protect the rights of individuals. POPIA is an act that derives from Section 14 of the Constitution. It derives from the Bill of Rights. It's a constitutional deriving piece of legislation. It's about protecting rights. Research ethics committees are also bodies that are concerned with ensuring there are no harms, no violation to human rights or other kinds of harms and violations to society and individuals as part of the research project, as part of research studies. They are already performing some of this work anyway. So research ethics committees may have, we hope it's only a kind of minimal adjustment to what they're already doing. But POPIA is going to impose new kind of processes and operations on all institutions across the country. That's going to happen anyway. So we are looking at how do we assist and provide guidance to institutions for ensuring compliance with POPIA within the already available structures that are well functioning, where there are existing oversight bodies such as the National Health Research Ethics Council that can perform some of these roles in relation to POPIA. We are looking at ways to cut extra resources that will need to be put in place for POPIA compliance, not to put new resource requirements on institutions. So extending the mandate of the RECs was something that's been considered kind of globally as one of the ways in which compliance with data protection laws can be best ensured within a research context, because they're particularly mindful to harms to individuals and harms to society. If that helps.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I hope that that is useful to people. And I think there were also still some of the participants who were struggling with the responsible party and, you know, who would be mandated to comply with the code of conduct. Is it a choice, or will everybody need to comply if they are a researcher?
So everybody will need to comply with POPIA, everybody. What we are doing is offering guidance for how to comply with an act that you already will have to comply with. Michelle, if I can, I just want to raise something that a member of the National Health Research Ethics Council has noted to us. So as part of the process in developing this code of conduct, which we've tried as far as possible to be as consultative as we can, including consulting other representative bodies within the research sector. One of the key bodies that we have been engaging with is the National Health Research Ethics Council, and we're still looking into what is the best way to put in place an oversight structure for the code of conduct and for compliance with POPIA.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I think I'm going to take another few questions, and then please raise your hands, as I said, committee, if you want to highlight certain things. So very early on in the questions section, there was two questions relating really to national databases and how POPIA will relate to those and for people to have access. So we understand, you know, that, for instance, the NHLS has a database. There may be databases in the Department of Health, NICD, and so on. So how will POPIA affect access to those databases? I'm not quite sure who wants to talk to that, but obviously, you know, we're here for open science and we want to ensure the data can be shared because that is how we enhance its value. So how can that be done in a responsible way, being compliant with POPIA? I don't know who would like to tackle that one. So I think that has been a concern to many people, because I think that people, you know, who are the custodians of these databases are also not always sure when they may or may not share data and how they should do this. And hopefully the code of conduct will provide some guidance. But I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that process. So Jerome, I see you happy to take a stab. Thank you very much.
It's only just a stab, not necessarily the answer, but I think a lot will depend on when these databases or when these banks were created. There would have been processes put in place in terms of access to this data bank. So you'll find sometimes there may be funder restrictions on what the data can be used for, who it can be shared with, and that will be subject to those terms and contracts that were governing those that collection. It may also be an institutional policy that may guide that, and you may find that you may need to go back to original consent forms. What did people consent to? Did they need to be contacted for future use of that research? So there'll be a whole range of different factors that I think, and there's not necessarily one answer that will govern all contexts. I think each one will be very specific to the data bank or the source of that, either the material or the data. And you're going to have to look at each one on an individual basis. Because, for example, if a research participant has given consent for for example, samples to be collected, but it was only to be used for that particular research, but that research the samples were kept for a few years and the data was kept for a few years, you may find that you may not necessarily be able to just access that without actually against that person's consent. And there'll be a different variety of different options and modalities like that. So I think each one will depend, and you may find that your funder may say that the research can or cannot be used, or where that research can and cannot be used. All of those things will dictate whether you can, in fact, go and access those particular sources of data. Over. There's just one stab at it. Over.
Thank you, Jerome. And I think it's really important to remind, all the people who are custodians of these data resources to start thinking about this, because it is so important to understand what would be permissible and not. And Rachel, I see that you'd like to also comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to add two things here. So Papia provides that where possible, where you can, personal data must be collected directly from the data subject. And there are certain exceptions for this. And one of the exceptions for this is where you are taking data or using data that is already in the public domain. So social media is one example of this, but publicly available data sets are another example. So there's two other kind of principles to then think about if you are a researcher wanting to use some of that information. One is the principle of data minimality. Do I need all of this data? What is the least personal data I can take for this? What do I actually need? And ensuring you take no more than you actually need for your research project. And then the second one is, can I take information that is de-identified? Information that's de-identified, and I know there's complexities that we've been talking about in terms of the de-identifiability of information, but once data is de-identified, POPIA no longer applies. So if possible, if you're a researcher, take only de-identified data, or de-identify that data that's in the public data set when you take it to use within a research project.
Thank you very much. And Alan, I see you'd also like to comment. Please go ahead.
Yeah, the question actually makes one wonders. When we are thinking of a code of conduct for research, we have been continuously thinking from the perspective of the researcher. But I think what the question does raise is there an opportunity for us to make reference to or comment on the role of our national repositories? And I'm particularly thinking of things like our biocollections framework that is being drafted. How do we inform that kind of policy to give thought to the requirement for the national repositories to have a system in place, or certainly a mechanism in place, whereby which they can outline the specifics around what can be accessed, what cannot be accessed, so that it can then work in concert with a code of conduct which is guiding the researcher. Over.
Thank you very much, Alan. I think that would be a very timely thing to do. And, you know, it is all about that responsible sharing and understanding the possibility of re-identification in the context of POPIA. So one of the other questions that have come up is, what if you started your research long before POPIA and your project is already in place? How do you ensure that it is compliant? So what about that retrospective information that's already been collected before? I don't know if there are other legal people, or Rachel, if you want to go with that again. I think some people are worried about their projects that are already in place and, you know, whether those are compliant or not at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, it would depend what type of personal information you're using. It would depend where you got the personal information from. Did you get it directly from the data subject? Was the information shared with you? Was it taken from the public domain? But if you have begun a research project, first of all, I think the information regulator, as with any kind of oversight body, would take into account that this guidance and the code itself has not come into effect. So that will be taken into account if any complaints are lodged against your research project at a later date. The point in time that you developed and began the research project and began the process of documentation would be taken into account. Generally, research institutions, when POPIA, and now would be a kind of good time to start doing this if you haven't already, would need to take stock of all the data sets that they have. They would need to de-identify those data sets where they don't need the personal markers and their identification. They would need to consider the data sets that they want to retain. POPIA allows you to retain information for research purposes where adequate safeguards are in place. So you would need to ensure there are adequate safeguards, security safeguards, for example, to prevent against breaches. And if you are retaining large data sets, there needs to be a record justifying why you're keeping that database. What is the lawful basis for you to be keeping that database? Is it because you're a research council and you have an act of parliament that mandates you to collect research? Are you keeping it because you got consent at the time of gaining consent to keep the data? Are you keeping it because you're a body established to perform research and that's your core function, and that you will be needing it in the future, and you're keeping it only for research purposes, and you're going to ensure that it's being only kept for research purposes? So these are the kind of questions that any institution that holds data for research purposes will need to be grappling with to ensure compliance by the 1st of July, generally with POPIA.
Thank you very much. I think lots for people to think about there. Alan, maybe just to ask you, there was a question about, you know, how much can one rely on automated methods for protecting private information, like, for instance, settings on REDCap? And, you know, how much should the researcher, you know, obviously they have to take personal responsibility, but can it be an automated process to ensure that there is protection of personal information, or less of a risk of releasing that inadvertently, I guess, to others?
So yeah, I think I actually saw that. I'm not sure if I replied. If I did, I'm not sure if I did a proper job of that. But I mean, for me, is that I think what is key is what is reasonably possible. And so I think that we all have to strive towards heightened security. And that is by no means 100% proof. But I do think that what we are wanting to do is to provide substantial proof that we have taken all reasonable action. And so in the context of REDCap, what measures are we putting in place to ensure that people cannot breach that? Because the challenge is when somebody comes and lodges a complaint, what are we going to fall back onto that we have not considered? And so I would say that probably the easiest obviously would be to not share that information. But in the event that you need to share that information, what measures are you going to use? And so we know of examples whereas within a collaborative project, even though we are not exposing personal information to the rest of the world, there are certainly examples where people are sending information about research to their collaborator via WhatsApp or via some other mechanism. And so in that case, we're going to have to revisit our practices and then start to ask, do we have a level of risk in sharing that particular info? So yes, so I think that still it comes down to the researcher. We certainly do not want to transfer that responsibility to an organization per se, but I do think that careful record keeping as to how we are implementing processes in order to protect that particular data item needs to be present.
Thank you very much, Alan. Jerome, would you like to comment as well?
Just very quickly, I think we also need to just remember that there are new emerging ways of collecting data automatically. And some of them are automated processes, and the new processes are using artificial intelligence. Sometimes you have bots that are collecting information, and research is increasingly making use of those technological platforms. So I think it will be quite important just to think about how you're collecting that information and who that information is going to be shared with and who will have access to that information. So if you're looking at an automated system, but if it's using artificial intelligence, does the developer have access to that information besides just the researcher? And I think that those are the types of issues that researchers who are looking at doing automated ways of collecting information for research-related purposes will need to start considering now. It'll be beyond just having a physical hard copy of data. These are just things that I think people should have on their radar and that people should start thinking about. Over.
Thank you. And Alan, I see you have more comment here.
Yes, it was actually one more general, because when I look at a lot of the questions that are coming, I think people are, and I think rightfully so, looking for tangible examples that could guide them. And so I think it's important to note that what we have done in this process is to highlight things that need to be considered. When the code is finally submitted, what we really want are specific guidelines to give to a researcher. And I think this is where it's important that we get some collective input from the community, in that there might be very specific examples where researchers have in fact applied a particular protocol that could be of value to the rest of us. And so I think from here on, it's key that we engage on really the tangible ways in which we could give guidance to a researcher who is about to embark on a research project. Over.
Thank you, Alan. And I can see that members of research ethics committees are also getting concerned and wanting to know whether there would be opportunities for training. So I don't know if there's anybody from a REC who would like to comment, but I think, all the institutions are going to have to look at that, but we do want to ensure that there is a national sort of standard which will be openly applied to all ethics committees when they review these proposals. So Harriet, would you like to comment on that?
Michelle, if I might, as a member of 2 RECs, I hope to be able to provide a bit of insight. So just to say, first of all, we are acutely aware that what this may look like is adding to the already extraordinary workload done by RECs. And we know that people on RECs spend hours and hours, often uncompensated, reviewing protocols and things. So we are trying to look at a way of leveraging existing mechanisms in a way that has as little extra burden on RECs as possible. And to that end, we're hoping in our code of conduct, and we aspire to also provide a set of templates that will be necessary to help REC members assess POPIA compliance and to help researchers to ensure that their protocols are POPIA compliant, guidelines on how to do the privacy risk assessment, guidelines on what your data privacy notice needs to look like. So because RECs are the obvious place to go, we need to incorporate RECs, but we are really hoping to make this process smooth and easy for RECs. And I believe the spirit that we are entering into this is also that if any point of guidance, training, additional information was needed, we would be sure to have a point person or a contact person available to provide that. So I think also to remember that this is an ongoing process, and even when the code of conduct is published, there might still be changes that are made. We might find that something doesn't work and we need to change it. So just to say that, although I'm not a lawyer, this does not seem to be something that is set in stone. So there is some flexibility. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I see that not everybody has the ability to put up their hands, but Alan, let me ask you to comment while we're still on this topic. You muted, Alan.
Now, I always say I'm not going to do that to myself. So what I think one is actually realizing more and more with large data sets and the need to, really ideally get ethics approval in real time. That would be the ultimate, I think. But I think what is useful for the scientific community to keep on their radar is some of the work that's being done by a consortium called Genomic Alliance for Genomic Health, GA4GH, and they put out a standard for commentary, which is around a data use ontology, which in fact promotes the use of certain tags when you are producing your data. And one has to think through how that applies in future, but we could see our processes evolving to a way we could speed up certain sections of our approval workflow, in that having data sets that could be enriched with certain tags that could give people the announcement that there are certain provisions made for this data set. I think we're going to see a future whereby that level of detail is probably going to find its way into our research ethics review process. And so I certainly second the comment made by the previous speaker that this is a process that will evolve, and I'm certain that we're going to work towards trying to certainly improve the turnaround time that we actually have these processes at play. Over.
Thank you, and thank you for reminding us that we need to engage with our communities so that they are also fully aware of what they're signing up for when they are participants in our research. I think that's really vital. Rachel, I wonder if I could ask you to raise the question that Antoinelle put in the chat box. Could you speak to that and then invite her to comment? It seems to be a legal issue.
I think Antoinelle was raising a question with regards to how do you determine what is the lawful basis for processing personal information. So whenever you process personal information, you'll need to determine what is the lawful basis on which you're doing that. And consent is a very obvious lawful basis. You have the consent from the person who the data belongs to process their personal information. But consent can at any time be withdrawn. And so some of the kind of best practice thinking that's coming out of different parts of the world is that consent shouldn't be the lawful basis, or it should only be the lawful basis when it's really necessary. And you should look at other lawful bases for why you need to process the personal information. And a lawful basis for most institutions, whether public and private, will relate to their legitimate interests as an institution. So, for example, in a university, its legitimate interest, its purpose for being a university is both to train and to teach students, and it is to conduct research. So there would need to be some explanation there, but that would be kind of one of the lawful bases for conducting research. Same with a private company. If it was a company that conducted research as part of its core function and it was necessary for their legitimate interests, but it's really about ensuring that there is a narrative which explains why you need to process personal information and that you have a very real and legitimate need, not just a kind of desire and want. There needs to be a legitimate need for why you need to process that personal information and also why you need to process so much of it. So this will be important for very large research studies that, you know, there's a current kind of mindset to in some spaces to collect and have as many research participants as possible. This aids in the kind of truthfulness of the science and the validity of the science that you're undertaking if you have a larger body of research subjects. But this will need to be explained as part of your research, as part of your lawful basis and recorded in the data management plan. Why am I using X amount of research subjects in my study? Can I respond to my research question in a way that's fully scientific without using so many research subjects? Is there a way of using less personal information as I try and respond to this particular research question? So all of this forms part of your lawful basis and will need to be included in any study, every study that uses personal information in the data management plan. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you. Altina, would you like to add something?
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, the only thing I wanted to add, thank you, Rachel, very much for outlining the issue. From the private company perspective, is it will also help if you can prove that your company is registered to do research. And I'm thinking, for instance, the way in which private companies are registered with the CIPC, so the Companies and Intellectual Property Commission. So there your core functions are defined. So you register your company for a specific purpose, and those purposes are then documented, and it's very clear that one of the purposes is then to do research, just to add to what Rachel was saying. Michelle, if I can address one other aspect quickly that was raised in the Q&A. Somebody asked about emails of students and so on, and the only thing I wanted to say there, and Alan, perhaps you can also come in, was that there are two aspects. The one is, of course, that the students must give permission in terms of emails to be used, but also then how we use these emails. So putting emails in just the copy line will no longer be acceptable. We will have to put it in the blind copy, carbon copy line, so in the BCC line, so that when email is sent out, everybody else that receives the email cannot see who else, cannot see other email addresses. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We don't have a lot of time left. Jantina, I was wondering, is there anything specifically on consent that you wanted to highlight from the questions?
Not specifically. I see Oyama Tsona asked an interesting question about representation. Oyama, my sense is that is just an artifact of the time of this particular scheduling. So the panel itself is quite diverse, but we have quite a few people from CSIR and MRC and other organizations that were not able to be here today. So I think that it's unfortunate, but it's just an artifact of the timing of the event.
Thanks, Jantina. But we can see that, you know, there is diversity amongst the people on the panel. So I'd, you know, be very happy for people to pipe up and give their views. But of course, we are sensitive to all those kinds of issues. I wanted to pick up one question, and Dominique, to address this to you. So somebody asked about whether whole genome sequencing, this is now just catapulting us onto a different discussion about genetic information, whether that would be any different to any other kinds of genetic information and would be more sensitive in some way. Dominique, would you like to address that?
Yeah, so this is actually a very interesting aspect, and thank you very much for the question. So we know that sort of 99.9% of the genomes of humans are the same across the board. So the question really does become that it is perhaps the 0.1% that is more sensitive, because that is something that would lead to more identification and singling out. So when it comes to whole genome sequencing, you know, you've got a large stretch of the genome that is not going to be able to single out an individual in that data set, because there's common shared information within the whole genome. The bigger question becomes when you are actually investigating the smaller subsections that do actually show differences between different people. And that is where the risk of re-identification, and particularly when you are combining that with other data, secondary data or secondary identifiers, that's where the risk comes in.
So essentially, you know, whether it's whole genome sequence data or other types of genetic data, doesn't matter. It's about whether there is some way of linking it to an identifiable person, but people shouldn't be stuck on, you know, the different levels of genetic information. Is that correct?
Yes, so what I would say is that, you know, we talk about a risk assessment, and we talk about this sort of assessment to see if a person can be identified from the information which you are utilizing. So if you are looking at the very the sort of parts of the genome that would allow for greater probability of identification or singling out of an individual in that particular data set, then that would be considered a higher risk piece of information. If you were looking at the whole genome sequence as a whole, it's still special personal information. It still needs to be protected, but it will fall into a lower risk category. And we also need to keep in mind the kind of technical skills required, the time required, as well as the technological advances that would allow a person to single out somebody else from the data set. So it is all levels of characterization of risk. Like I said in the presentation, a higher level of risk, the higher amount of protection needs to be placed, and that can be organizational protection or technological protection.
Thank you very much, Dominique. I just want to remind our listeners that the South African Journal of Science is starting a sort of a discussion forum on Papia, and you know, we have our discussion document that we've put up there, which we're really hoping you will respond to. But people are very welcome to also do sort of short articles where they can actually give their viewpoints or highlight one or two issues that they would like to have highlighted. So one of the other sets of questions, I don't know, maybe I should just pause here for a moment and ask any of the speakers or panelists whether there is an issue that they would like to pick up from the questions and just comment on. I'll just pause here a moment. Rachel, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you, Michelle. I wanted to just take the opportunity while we have so many of you here to talk about the guidance documents, the addendums that we are developing alongside the actual code of conduct, that I think will be the real meat of how POPIA compliance with the code of conduct can happen in practice. So I quickly wanted to run through what are those addendums, what are those kind of extra guidance documents we're developing, and to see whether there's anything we're really missing, if anyone had any other kind of ideas about other kind of guidance that it would be really important that is developed alongside this code of conduct. So the first thing was the augmented consent forms. Under POPIA, this is called the privacy notice, as Jantina explained. The consent forms that are currently used within ethics will need to include some of the kind of additions that POPIA sets out, so that the data subject knows who has their information at any given point, how they can access it, how they can delete it. We're also considering explaining to data subjects, research participants in our context, what it means for their rights when their information is de-identified. this is one of those spaces where the legal doesn't address some of the ethical concerns. So the law says that once your information is de-identified, it's no longer covered under POPIA. POPIA no longer applies. It only applies to personal information, not de-identified information. But of course, that information exists because the person gave it. The person in question is the kind of condition of possibility of that information existing in the first place. So we're considering including within the consent form information about when your information is de-identified, you no longer have any rights to it. It's no longer your information. You can no longer access it or delete it. So including something akin to a right to be de-identified in the consent. I consent to my data being de-identified. This is something we're considering, and it's been kind of discussions with partners in the European Union, with kind of colleagues in the European Union who are considering something similar. So a detailed kind of consent form is one of the things that we're developing. Then the data management plan that Alan's spoken about, that I've spoken about, that will include some of those kind of details for POPIA compliance, the lawful basis, who's the accountable party, have you done the risk assessment? Then we will include a template for that risk assessment, which will include things like, you know, what type of information am I processing? Am I collecting the information directly from the data subject? Am I using data transfers? And as colleagues have spoken about, how de-identifiable is my data? The other thing we'll be developing is standard contractual clauses for data transfer agreements where the transfer will be cross-border, where you're sharing data outside of South Africa. We will be developing a kind of privacy impact assessment guidance for how you can conduct a privacy impact assessment if your study is high risk and needs that. And in terms of POPIA, information officers must review the privacy impact assessment. So this would be squarely within the duty of the information officer at an institution to review. Yeah, I think those are the key things. So the consent form, the data management plan, standard contractual clauses, and the risk assessment and privacy impact assessment. We'll also be developing a kind of ethics checklist, but we will be engaging. We have a specific consultation with research ethics committees that we hope to have in the very near future, where we can understand in much more detail what is the guidance they need, what are they already doing that effectively amounts to POPIA compliance, what extra little bits need to take place. So we hope to put together a kind of checklist for POPIA compliance for RECs. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you. I'm sure that people are usually relieved to know that all these templates and documents will be forthcoming. And just to say to members of RECs, you know, if you already have documents that you'd like to share for them to be taken into consideration, that would be really helpful. But as Rachel mentioned, we are planning another engagement event specifically with Research Ethics Committee members. So we are coming to a close. I don't know if there are any other burning questions from any of the panelists. I was really pleased about the question that somebody put up about the open science policy, which is being developed at a national level at the moment, with its principle being to be as open as possible and as closed as necessary. Because I think in terms of research, you know, we certainly want to see that, and that POPIA and the way that we develop the code of conduct will enable that. So I think, thank you very much for reminding us that our code of conduct is not being done in isolation, but certainly we'll be speaking to many other policies and regulations that are around in the domain of research. So I don't see any other hands up or
Michelle,
comments.
sorry, on my side, just very briefly, I see Samuel Simango asked, how will people be able to comment on the discussion paper? And Maputi has just put a link in the chat as well. So just wonder if you can say something about how people contribute if they want to.
Thank you very much. So the South African Journal of Science has opened a portal where people can actually online enter their comments or points, And as I understand, but I can be corrected, that this will be available online. So when you've read the document, the discussion document, there'll actually be a link in the portal where you can provide your comments. But I think people are also welcome to address the Academy of Science of South Africa with their questions. Rachel, I don't know if you have more information or whether Susan or somebody else would like to comment on that process. And just to remind everybody that we're requesting written reports and written inputs by the 14th of May. We know it's only 2 weeks away, and we hope that this will give you time to actually give us more input and guidance. Rachel?
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. So we are in the process of putting together the Code of Conduct and the supporting addendums and guidance notes. We are hoping to get this to the information regulator by the end of May. That's why we have the date of the 14th of May for comments on the discussion document that outlines the kind of key issues that we're going to be dealing with in the Code of Conduct. Once the information regulator receives our Code of Conduct, they will publish it for public comment. So that will be the opportunity to comment on the full draft of the Code of Conduct. We are under some kind of time constraints, given that this comes into effect, POPIA comes into effect. Institutions are required to be compliant with POPIA by the 1st of July. So we're mindful of that. We're mindful of wanting to have a Code of Conduct submitted to the IR for approval before that date, so that there's not a kind of gap. In any event, POPIA will be in effect and institutions will need to be in compliance with POPIA at that point, and our code simply provides further guidance on how to be compliant. Yeah, thank you, Michelle.
Thank you very much. So I'm just quickly scanning through these questions. I can see there's still many of them. And we certainly, you know, all the slides will be available. You already have the links up so that you can access them. And we will certainly look at all the questions again and address those. And I think at this stage, I'd like to hand over to Himla Sujal, the Chief Executive Officer for ASIF, to just give some concluding remarks and also talk about the way forward. So Himla, over to you.
Thanks, Michelle, and good day to everyone on this chat. I realize that 2 hours is a very short time to discuss such an important issue, but I just want to raise a few points. Firstly, I just want to, for those people who don't understand the history of how ASIF got involved, early in September last year, Dr. Kiara Staunton and Michelle Ramsey sent me a memo to ask if ASIF would be interested in a dialogue on the Protection of Personal Information Act. They sent me some documentation on a publication that some people on this committee and on the participation component of the chat had co-authored, and that was published in the South African Medical Journal. And it was about broad consent and how all of this impacted with the publication of the POPIA Act. And I wish to acknowledge Dr. Glodina Lutz from the DSI, who also wrote to me separately to ask if ASIF would consider getting involved in participating in overseeing such a process, given ASIF's neutral role and being made up of many expert academics across various disciplines, and the fact that we have the power to convene meetings with various stakeholders. Once I had a little bit of a chat with Michelle and so on, I then approached the Department of Science and Innovation, the Program 4, chaired by Dr. Danny Addendums, and the discussions with Dr. Seglin Moodley, who's also on the participation chat. And after I brought to their attention why ASIF would possibly be a good vehicle for which to bring this to the public, I was given the go-ahead to pursue. And that's when I engaged further with Michelle and Rachel, and you've seen in the introduction the pipeline of activities that ensued. Well, following our initial outreach meeting and subsequently with the Science Forum, we set up these reference groups and the reference group and the drafting committee. And I want to acknowledge every single member of those two groups. They have worked tirelessly since from December last year, I would imagine, prior to Science Forum. And they meet every 2 weeks and they engage for over 2 hours. They have working groups that have taken over the responsibility of various components that you have heard of today, and eventually drafted the discussion paper that is now published in the South African Journal of Science. And even through this process of engagement, I wish to acknowledge the members of the NHREC, in particular, Professor Sukacha and Professor Minri Krief, who have also met with some of us over the weeks and given unstintingly of their time to ensure that the process that ASAF was engaging with and their own thematic activities were brought in proximity, so that we had the vantage of their insights along the way as well. Similarly, we have had engagements outside of the group with other experts to comment on the documents, etc. And so when you ask why did ASAF get involved, well, let's assume that there was no submission of a code of conduct for research. All the questions, etc., that you've posted on the chat and you've asked, etc., to whom would those responsibilities eventually fall to? So basically, ASAF has got involved in this collaborative way with the various stakeholders to kind of buffer the nervous tension that exists, to provide insights from experts. And I must say, there have been some really good discussions, even within the drafting committee and the reference group and between the two. So it isn't a simple task of just doing something. And hopefully, as you all engage with the discussion paper and think about your own situation in terms of research and what is missing for you to conduct your research within the context of compliance of the POPIA Act, please raise it with the committee. You have seen postings of links where you could find the documentation, where you can find the links. ASAF's website has created a specific link to the POPIA page. There's the link to the SAJS. And if those still are not sufficient, then you're welcome to email Maputi, who has been sending out some of the notices, to Susan Felsman, who is my colleague, who is overseeing the project on behalf of ASAF, to either Rachel Addendums, but preferably if it would come to ASAF, and then we would assist so that we don't clog up the emails of the reference group members and the drafting committee. So colleagues, this is a long road, it's a long journey, and it is something that ASAF took on because we believe in the support of scholarly activities and advancing scholarship across the board in the national system of innovation. And so we would want your support. Please spread the word. As you've heard from Jerome earlier, there are over 85,000 people in this domain of research and development. We have tried our best to engage as widely through the universities and other stakeholder portals affiliated on our network. We can't reach every single individual. We have done the best that we can, and it is only through your input that we will be able to draft the proper code in the context in which the information regulator requires it. I can confirm to you that we did submit an intention to the information regulator at the end of last month. And that was on Friday that paperwork has gone through. And so we have also worked in close contact with some members from the Information Regulator's Office to ensure that we did our work within the confines of what is required of us. So I just want to once again thank Michelle Ramsey, Rachel Addendums, and all members of that committee and of the two committees. I want to thank you all for your participation. And last but not least, I want to thank Maputi, Ina Smith, Susan Felsman from ASAP, together with other colleagues at ASAP, who work tirelessly behind the screens to ensure that this communication, and our communications officer, Henriette Wagner, is also online to make sure that everyone is brought on this journey as we take it forward. There's a lot that ASAP has taken on in terms of compliance, and it doesn't end with the submission. It continues for a couple of years going forward, so that we play our role in terms of the governance and of the code, as Rachel has alluded to during her presentation. So I know everybody has got lots to go on and take care of for the rest of the day. Thank you very much for giving us your time to be part and parcel of this very important process. And we do look forward to hearing from you so that your voice and your comments are taken consideration of, and that we leave no one behind in the process of engaging during this process. Thank you all and have a good day going forward. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Himla. I think you've said it all, and for us to thank you for taking this on behalf of ASAP. And we know it is a huge task, and we've learned so much and realized that the challenge is even bigger than we thought at the beginning when we put our toes in the water. So a good thank you from me as well to all the panelists, everybody who's involved with the drafting and guiding the process, but also to thank everybody who's put up questions. This is really helping us think this through. And a special thank you again to Rachel, who's taking the brunt of the writing. And just to say, we're enormously thankful for this process. So with that, I'm going to close this forum and thank you all again.